Hello and welcome to Media Monitor on the SABC News Channel, independent and impartial. This is where we take a look inside the world of media, analysing the trends, the issues and the reporting of some of the week's top stories. I'm Peter Ndoro and this is what's coming up on the show. We'll be unpacking how the SABC plans to introduce an annual household levy of 265 Rand for every household that has a TV set or a device that can actually stream its services. Also, in trying to find different ways to do journalism and tell stories, we speak to a journalist in West Africa who's adding graphic journalism or comics journalism to her work. And also in a week where we saw a man killed in the middle of police action on students in Johannesburg, our News and History feature takes you back to 2011. And that's at another time when the police were called into question for the actions that they took at that time. So try and remember what that was a little bit later on. Okay, so that's what's on the show, but remember you can get engaged with us on SABC Media Monitor and the number is on WhatsApp is 065-862-4548. That number again, 065-862-4548 if you want to engage with us on the program on social media. But before we get into our highlighted stories on the program, let's first take a look at what's on the front pages of our Sunday newspapers this morning. We begin with the Sunday Times, and the lead story there has Public Works Minister Patricia De Lille firing off dozens of letters of demand to serving and former ministers and MPs, pleading with them to cough up millions of rand in unpaid rents for their taxpayer-subsidised homes. The minister is attempting to recover almost 8 million rand from MPs and ministers, which is believed to be just a fraction of the 3 billion rand owed to the Department of Public Works and Infrastructure. And part of it, some of South Africa's companies and even government departments owing. The City Press, well, that's leading with the headline, Higher Education Minister Leanne De Basson-Pierre under fire. This refers to students wanting debt scrapped, else universities will face a total shutdown. Yeah, the ultimatum issued to the state to write off a student debt of 10 billion rand has been described by one Vice-Chancellor as a national crisis rather than a university problem. The Sunday Independent is leading with the current crisis in higher education as well, saying that a varsity shutdown is looming as a student fee debt estimated to be 14 billion rand and is still mounting. Protests over exclusion are spreading across the country. Tertiary institutions are believed to be bracing themselves for a possible nationwide shutdown. And the funding crisis and there's rising student protests over fees is threatening to derail the 2020 academic year, the paper is reporting. The Sunday Tribune is leading with news about the passing of King Goodwill Zwelithini, saying that Inkosi Mangosuthu Buthelezi, the king's traditional prime minister, confirmed that the Zulu monarch died of COVID-19 related complications. The paper says Buthelezi also confirmed allegations of tensions within the Zulu monarchy between Buthelezi and the princes over how the burial of the late king should be conducted. The Weekend Argus on Sunday is leading with a story of a Cape Town family that runs a funeral company which is leading with the South African government for help after an undertaker transporting bodies has been detained in Mozambique on suspicion of being a drug mule. Mozambique police are accusing Patrick Lunguza of hiding drugs inside 5 bodies that he was transporting to Malawi. He's also facing charges of assisting illegal immigrants traveling with him using expired passports. The Sunday World has former President Jacob Zuma on its front page. The paper is reporting that Zuma is at risk of losing his prized Nkandla home. Apparently, the former president had been ordered to pay arrears on his VBS loan. Lawyers of the VBS curator ordered Zuma to pay at least 250,000 rand by the end of last week. Zuma was loaned 7.8 million rand by VBS in September 2016 to pay what he had owed for the costs of the upgrade to his Nkandla homestead. All right, so that's the Sunday newspapers, and we'll take a closer look at some of those stories later on in the program, so stay with us for that. But first, most of you actually get your news on social media, don't you? So let's take a look at some of the trending topics on social media this morning. And Sacred Space, usual story. ENCA, stop harassing EFF. There's been this spat that's been playing out between these two for a number of years now. This is not a new story for sure. Blessed Sunday, Block 2. But rest in peace, Menzi Ngubane. That's the one that's really touched people's hearts. And a lot of people have been sharing their thoughts, remembering him in many ways, as Kathleen does here. And also ZY, there's a picture of the original Generations, and he says, I've never watched Generations, the legacy, I'm true to my people. And that, of course, was the original Generations. What a loss, what a pity. Rest in peace, legend. Ngamla wetu, Ngwenya wetu. That's rest in peace, Menzi Ngubane. And Felicia says, yeah, a giant has fallen. Rest in peace, Menzi. We'll forever celebrate you. You made my childhood very interesting because you were starring. We all wanted to see on TV. Lala kahle Ngwenya wena Dlomo. Now, it's being reported the South African Broadcasting Corporation plans to introduce an annual household levy of 265 rand on the 8 million households currently in its TV license billing system. So the public broadcaster is proposing that the TV license fees be scrapped in favor of a compulsory public broadcasting levy for every household that has a TV set or a device that can stream its services. The SABC said that the levy should apply to all households, including those that use smartphones, tablets and computers to stream TV and radio shows, even if they were not watching SABC programs. Now, to help us explore this, we're now joined by Mpho Ndaba, who's the Deputy Chairperson of the SOS Coalition, which is a member-based public broadcasting network that campaigns for democratic media and broadcasting, as well as excellent programming by the public broadcaster to serve the public interest. Thanks very much indeed. And also William Bird, who's the Director at Media Monitoring Africa. To both of you, thanks for joining us and welcome to the program.
Thank you, Peter.
All right, so let me start with you, Mpho, and William, it's the same question for you as well. Your thoughts about this new household levy that the SABC is mooting?
Thank you, Peter. Good morning to the listeners at home. One of the things that we've been advocating for years, particularly when you consider the fact that, when it comes to the funding of the SABC, we advocate for a mixed model, which includes government funding, sponsorships, advertising, and of course, TV licenses. What this does is that it expands the very aspect around TV licenses, particularly if you consider the fact that when I spoke to you previously, we were talking about how there has been a failure in terms of collection of TV licenses. You have 3 to 5%, and that is not really effective when it comes to helping the SABC to become sustainable. So as a coalition, we are very much in favor, and we do support this proposed measure to try and ensure that the SABC is able to generate income. And if you've seen the reports as well, about 2 billion rand is set to be collected if we were to follow this measure. And of course, we must also note that it's not the only source. It shouldn't be the only source of of funding for the SABC. Government must chip in, but it's something that we're really much in support of.
All right. William, your thoughts? I mean, essentially, this is a tax, isn't it? And I wonder if this is the way to go, because a lot of people will get caught in this net, as it were.
Yeah, good morning. So I think there are a couple of points. The first is this is part of a draft white paper that seeks to update our very out-of-date broadcast policy. You know, we haven't had new media policy for over 2 decades. So people should expect that things are going to be quite dramatically different in terms of the ideas and proposals that are being put forward in this draft white paper. And really it's critical, and I mention it because it seeks to deal not just with SABC, but with the whole media environment. And there's this critical issue of media sustainability. So for us, the basic point of departure is this, is that if you want to have a democratic state, as we do, you need critical independent media. And part of that makeup is that you need a credible public broadcaster. If you go around the world and you look at where they have functioning public broadcasters, the highest levels of trust tend to be in those public broadcasters. So they fulfill a really important role for your democracy. Now, if we accept that we need a diverse media and that a public broadcast is part of that, you then have to say, well, how on earth do we fund that? And one of the mechanisms is this. So at the moment, it's not a tax because if that is an alternative suggestion that you do actually have a tax. This is a public information levy, if you like, where people that have those devices would then make that one payment per household. Again, it's on the basis of the SABC current TV license amount, which, as far as I can remember, hasn't been changed for at least a decade. So people are still paying the same 265 Rand. So this is just a way of trying to enforce that by asking MultiChoice effectively to collect that on the SABC's behalf. So there are a lot of things that are there that are quite radical proposals to say, well, how do we sustain a public broadcaster? Because a public broadcaster is absolutely essential for our democratic state. And the moment we accept that, we then just have to say, well, how do we find mechanisms that can allow us to fund it in a sustainable manner?
All right, so my question to you is, why aren't people paying their TV licenses? It's only 265 Rand, which is about 22 Rand a month. There's a graphic up on the screen now to compare what we pay in South Africa with the United Kingdom, for example, because we're actually, in the world, one of the cheapest. In England, they pay 3,277 Rand for their TV license, and yet they've only got an evasion rate of 7.2%. Our evasion rate is 76%. So 3/4 of South Africans just can't be bothered to pay their TV license, 22 Rand a month, which is nothing. So I just want to know why is it that they're not paying? Because if we had a evasion rate of just under 50%, the SABC would be profitable. We would not be losing money and probably not losing jobs. Paul?
Well, Peter, I think there's a range of factors, right? First of all, it's not really enforceable. If you look at some of those countries that you've mentioned, especially in the case of the UK, there is a consequence, legally speaking, if you do not pay your TV license. And of course, I'm very much careful to not suggest that people must be arrested if they fail to pay their TV license. But my point really is that it's not really as enforceable as it can be. Secondly, we also have to acknowledge the fact that the narratives around the SABC, the crisis for years have really created a public sentiment around the fact that the institution is not that useful, that whatever money that gets collected or is really, thrown into the institution might be used for other reasons other than ensuring that the institution is sustainable. So there's a range of factors, really, and of course, again, I think for me, at least, there's a sense that we, as the public, are then not taking accountability insofar as ensuring that this idea of SABC as ours is not coming to life. Because I think paying your TV license is one of the ways in which we get to participate in the ownership of the institution itself.
William, the fact is people are watching the SABC, so why aren't they paying? Yes, there is the history, but 22 Rand a month, is that a lot?
So look, there is a significant issue here, which is that one of the big problems with the TV license is that it's not a fair tax, and that 22 Rand a month to you and I is not that much money. But for people that are living on a grant system, that is a lot of money, So we do have to acknowledge that. And I think that when we look at how this could potentially be rolled out, that needs to be taken into consideration. So I think we need to look at effectively those that are living on the grant system not being expected to make that household fee. But I think that the primary narrative, certainly from the various discussions and interviews that I've seen and the various social media discussions on this, is that people just are deeply cynical about any kind of public institution and wanting to give more money into that. And if you look at that, so in as much as the SABC has been riddled with crisis for the last decade and a half. And remember, part of the state capture project was exactly that notion, that you take an institution and you operate it on the basis of lurching from crisis to crisis, because it's in that moment of crisis that people can employ whoever they like. They don't need to follow procedure. They can do pretty much whatever they like and get away with it, and that was exactly what happened within the public broadcaster, but within so many, almost every one of our public institutions. So when you say to them people, okay, now we want you to actually pay for this, they're going to go, well, come on now, you just need to look at the news on a daily basis and see that whenever you pay your money in, it just seems to go down the toilet. You do it for Eskom, whatever the institution, there's a profound and understandable cynicism about those things. What we are seeing, though, is that certainly in the last 4 years, for example, we've seen a significant increase in trust and credibility around the SABC. They keep doing a lot of the basics right and getting them right. And as much as there's still a lot of controversies there, and there's still the issue of retrenchments and a whole range of things that are deeply uncomfortable. We're trying to get an SABC that has to move and operate as a digital public service content provider, which is a massive shift from where we were. And we have to make sure that we, can offer something that offers credible, trustworthy news. And there, if you look at it under the SABC recently, under Patricia, you've seen a massive and significant, fantastic improvement in the quality of news overall. So of course there's slippages here and there, but broadly speaking, if you look at where it was in like 2016 to where it is now, it's like a completely different institution, and that kind of thing is really good at building it. But remember, public trust, it's very easy to erode and very, very difficult to rebuild.
All right, and Paul, it does seem that there's not a level playing field when it comes to the public broadcaster versus the private institutions that are sitting on DSTV, for example. This must carry order where SABC's channels sit on these platforms. It seems as if these platforms are selling decoders and so on and so forth, selling the SABC as part of their package. Surely the SABC is entitled to some revenue because we're producing the content, it's sitting on their subscription packages, and they're getting paid.
Yes, Peter, you're very right. I mean, this is also one of the things that we've been advocating for as an organization, because you're right. If you look at the number of people who watch, multi-choice, particularly with interest on SABC content, it's great numbers. And it's unfair that the SABC is not able to gain any revenue from that. So we do really advocate, for multi-choice for the SABC to be able to generate funds rather, as a result of that. So must carry, must pay is something that we also have to have a conversation about, and also as part of this broader discussions around the possible changes that might take place within the media landscape.
William, the public broadcaster, unlike the private institutions, must account to the public, I guess, because the public funds them. Does that translate into the public then having a say in what they watch on our public broadcaster?
So ideally, it should. I think, again, one of the historical realities of the SABC, all of our media broadly, and the SABC in particular, has been that they've operated very aloof from the public. They haven't sought to engage with the public and build that relationship and that sense of ownership that Paul spoke about at the beginning. And that's really critical, because we do need people to see this as their public broadcaster. So in as much as they command the biggest audiences, and as much as this is the place clearly where most of the people in our country can see themselves and their stories and their views and their languages particularly reflected, I don't think that we've managed to build up that sense of ownership. And part of that is about the fact that there's very few occasions where people actually can participate effectively in some kind of dialogue with the SABC. One of the good things that they have done, although it be haphazardly, is that they've sought to get people's views on things like the revised editorial policies. So that's one way that you can start to build it. But there used to be kind of listener groups and sounding boards for these things. And one of the mechanisms that the SABC, I think, has been looking at is trying to make sure that they engage more regularly and frequently with the public, and not just with the official public representatives being Parliament and the minister. So we do need to find much better ways of encouraging the people to have that sense of ownership, but also that sense of participation in what can and should be there. So part of that should be around what kind of programming, what local content, what kind of news there is, etc. And we've seen that part of the responsiveness of that has been from news, whereas it's become increasingly digital. They've facilitated that process. So like this program, you ask people their views on the latest news things, and then you reflect that, their polls in the news and those kinds of things. So there is that beginning of dialogue, but I'm not sure that it's where we would like it to be, for people to feel that this is our broadcaster.
All right, William, we're going to talk to you again a little bit later on in the program, but one final word from you and Paul. I guess when we're considering a funding model, it's quite important to have at the back of your mind, you don't want political interference and political pressure, particularly if the funding seems to be coming from that one source, which may be government, treasury. There could be pressure, couldn't there, in terms of interference in the running of the corporation?
Yeah, look, Peter, I'm glad that you bring this up, because I think it expands the conversation beyond just one source of funding, as I earlier noted. I think when it comes to the SABC, we've seen the governing party, the ANC, making resolutions in the past. I think in 2012, claiming, or rather, promising that they would increase the funding of the SABC, yet that has not happened. So in a way, what you've had is that outside the question of funding, or the stake that the state has on the SABC, still you've had instances where there have been attempts to ensure political interference. So I think it's something that we need to be careful about, as part of the conversation, to say that, yes, the state has an obligation to ensure that the SABC is sustainable, particularly when it comes to funding. And of course, that doesn't mean that there aren't going to be attempts to ensure that the interests of political parties are advanced within the institution. If you look at other countries, you have instances where states contribute towards these institutions. Yet the question of political interference is not as pronounced as it has been in the case of South Africa. So I think it's a conversation that we have to have in two kind of senses, essentially, to say that yes, it's necessary to ensure that the institution is funded. At the same time, we do have to ensure that we time and again revisit the question of the independence of the institution, because it has to be independent after all.
Mpo Ndaba, Deputy Chairperson of the SOS Coalition, thanks very much indeed for talking to us, and we look forward to another conversation in the near future. Thank you very much. All right, okay, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, graphic journalism, comics journalism, illustrated journalism, it's called many things, and we'll find out from one journalist in West Africa why she's experimenting with this. Stay with us. Now, storytelling in news has been with us since the beginning of time, but over the years, the methods used to tell those stories have changed, particularly as we've entered a digital and multimedia environment. Now, one method that is becoming increasingly visible is when journalists use a combination of illustration and text to tell a timely, reported non-fiction story. Graphic journalism, sometimes called comics journalism, illustrated journalism, visual reportage, and non-fiction cartooning, which uses artwork as a primary method to telling the story. Typically, sources are actual people featured in each story, and the word balloons are actual quotes. Well, one journalist who's started experimenting with this form of storytelling is Ivory Coast-based news correspondent Leanne De Basson-Pierre. She joins me now from Abidjan. Leanne, good morning, bonjour, comment ça va?
Good morning, Peter. It's so lovely to be on the show again.
Great, lovely to have you, but I'm amazed and pleasantly surprised with this new experiment that you have. What inspired you to try this new form of journalism? I say new, but not really.
Well, I think I was very lucky and it kind of just happened upon me. I'm married to a Belgian. I have to start off saying that. So the last few years, I've really gotten into comics, where in the French-speaking world, it's very, very popular, even into adulthood. So it's not just for kids. So we've got hundreds of comics in our house. My children can be seen reading comics at all hours of the night and day. So is my husband, and I've taken to it as well. So that's kind of where my love for it started. And then a few weeks ago, I had an interesting story that I wanted to tell from Ivory Coast. I contacted the editor of The Continent, where my piece was published. And I said, oh, I've got this interesting story. And he said, you know, we've been in contact rather with an Ivorian cartoonist. He's very keen to get published in our weekly newspaper. Would you be keen to collaborate with him and see how you could tell the story together? So it ticked a lot of boxes for me. It was a new challenge. It was working with a young local person. It was collaborating. It was trying something new. And that's how I ended up publishing this story.
What difference do you think it makes to have this kind of storytelling? Because you've got the print version, and alongside that you've got this comics version. I'll use that term so that people really sort of on the same page as us. Does it make a difference?
I think it makes an immense difference, especially when you've got quite a strong character that's central to the story that you're trying to tell. I think it adds a lot of intimacy. You can actually give the characters those word bubbles, and the quote doesn't fall flat. You can add a lot of mood in the story, and you can really bring the story to life in a different way than what you would with just words.
All right. So now some might ask, is this for a younger audience?
It's funny. Several people have asked me that. So they're saying, is it for a younger audience? And I think specifically with The Continent, they're very experimental. Simon Allison, who edits The Continent, he's amazing and very open to new forms of storytelling. And so I think I really had a big chance actually working with him, and him accepting this piece and accepting to publish it. I guess you could say it could attract a bigger audience. It's a different way of telling the story, especially as Africans wanting to share our stories across the continent. So it could be that is something that we work towards doing more of. But it's not new. It's something that is very, very popular in the French-speaking world. And a lot of graphic journalists from the US or Canada or elsewhere even Japan, that is, they've come to Europe and mainly French-speaking countries, and they've tried to publish there, and they have published them. They have been very successful in publishing there.
All right, so it's not new though, is it? I mean, I came across something back in history, the 18th century. I think it was the Leslie, what was it called? The Leslie Illustrated newspaper, and they covered it, used illustrations to cover the American Civil War. So do you think it's enjoying a revival, or what's happening?
Yeah, there've been some interesting works that have come out in the last in the last several years. One of my favorite graphic journalists is somebody called Joe Sacco. He's a Maltese American graphic journalist, and he's won several awards for the work that he's done on Israeli-Palestinian relations in his book Palestine and Footnotes from Gaza, among many others. We also had Art Spiegelman, who in his work Mouse, which is really a memoir interviewing his father and talking about the Holocaust. And he actually won a special Pulitzer for that. So it seems like we go through times in our history where it gains momentum and then it kind of fades away for a little bit. And it could be now that, as we look at different storytelling methods, that it will see a revival in the future.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about your readers. I know it's new for them, but you have asked them for feedback, and have they given you feedback? What do they think?
We had a lot of great feedback, actually, both on Twitter to me directly and people using the email and phone numbers and WhatsApp, etc. Speaking to Simon Allison, the editor of The Continent, directly as well. He said to me on Friday, he said, we had amazing feedback. They really want more of this kind of journalism and more of this kind of experimental journalism as well. So not just that, maybe branching out into something different, maybe, having more of the Zapiro style cartoon as well. But really what you need is you need a good story first. You need good characters. So not just doing, graphic journalism for the sake of doing graphic journalism. So I'm looking forward to doing a lot more. I'm working on an interesting piece at the moment. So stay tuned and watch the space.
And I guess the skill as well is with the artists that you use is the characters have got to look like the real characters.
I think there's a fine balance that needs to be struck. You don't also want people to be offended by how much weight you put on them in the pictures, for example. But yeah, I think in the piece that I did for The Continent, the artist that I worked with, he really did it very well. I think it really speaks to it. And in that particular, the process of how we did it, we didn't actually go into the field together. I did the reporting, I did the writing, I took little videos and photos, and throughout the reporting process, because it was outside of Abidjan that I did the reporting, we were talking all the time. I was sending little videos, I was explaining, I was sending photos. Before that, we had done kind of a rough sketch of what we were kind of looking for, where we thought the story would start, where it would lead to, where it would end. Obviously, we revised it several times throughout the process. And it's not just something that you do in one day. So it took a few days, but we actually ended up working very well together. It was a very good fit, and I'm looking forward to doing a lot more with him.
All right, Leanne, a question for you. What's the difference between what you're doing, this graphic journalism, storylines with cartoons, and what people like Zapiro have been doing for years, one cartoon usually?
Yes, so it's just different forms of expression. I think obviously the reporting that you need to do for a graphic journalism piece of at least 3, 4 pages, it takes a lot more time. Whereas a cartoon like somebody like Zapiro does, it can be linked to news and actuality, which it always is, and he's always spot on. He's been a huge inspiration. I know for Roland Pullman, the young Ivorian artist that I've been working with, he immediately, when I said I'm South African, Zapiro was the first person that he named, and many others on the continent that are using this medium to communicate and to tell stories. So I think that they work really well hand in hand. I don't think that there's a big difference, but they're telling different kinds of stories.
All right, we live in a digital era now, so when I think of cartoons and graphic illustrations, I think of something that I hold in my hand. Is this something, though, that we'll start to see perhaps digitally as well, animated?
You never know. There's nowadays you actually need to have the platform, and with the specific one that we publish now, it was published in a newspaper that is sent via WhatsApp every Saturday morning. So there is space for it. There is ways to improve it. There are ways to try to find more avenues to do this. And in fact, one of the projects that the young Ivorian artist that is working on, he wants to create something like that locally. So something like the continent locally that is shared via WhatsApp, but using this cartoon format. So I think, and we've spoken about this in the last couple of weeks, how a publication like the continent has given room for African journalists across the continent to tell stories, but also how you're going to be seeing in the next few years how there are offshoots of this kind of publication and how it inspires journalists in their individual countries to try to create platforms for their local journalists to tell their stories.
All right. You know what, Leanne, it's been a pleasure talking to you, and it's so good to see this innovation, and I look forward to the next set. Thanks so much indeed for talking to us, and we'll chat again soon.
A pleasure as always.
All right, that's Leanne De Basson-Pierre joining us from Abidjan in West Africa, Ivory Coast, and she's experimenting with graphic journalism, and it's, I suppose many of us will call them cartoons, but yeah, illustrated journalism, whatever name you want to apply to it, but I think it does add something to telling those stories. Now, on the 8th of March, Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni said that he was bringing legal action against the Daily Monitor for the reporting that the Wall Street Journal had said his inner circle was given Chinese-made vaccines against COVID-19 ahead of other people in Uganda. Well, speaking about the paper, Museveni said, "Monitor, I'm going to make you bankrupt." He added that he would go ahead with the threatened lawsuit unless the newspaper's journalists apologize and lie down and say sorry. When reached by Reporters Without Borders, one of the Daily Monitor's editors confirmed that the president's lawyers had written to the newspaper to notify them of their client's intention to bring legal action against the publication. Now it's time for us to go back into our news archives, and today we take you back to the 13th of April 2011 when the video footage of a 33-year-old Andries Tatane caused public uproar. This is how the SABC covered the story.
Welcome to the news at 7. In one of the most shocking scenes of police brutality, a protester was shot dead at point-blank range when a service delivery march turned violent at Vicksburg in the Free State. Police say they have opened a case of murder and the Independent Complaints Directorate will investigate. Another 45 people were arrested for public violence and the situation remains tense. The SABC captured the shooting on camera. We warn the following visuals are of a sensitive and violent nature.
It started as a peaceful march, but there was little doubt that many residents were angry. They were demanding action from a municipality they say have constantly ignored their calls to deliver. When the march met up with police at the municipal offices, the resulting scuffle was both brutal and shocking. Protesters insisted they had not provoked the police, and the municipality says it was on course to address the problems.
We are busy finalizing agreements with the spheres of government, national and province, that we must get an additional 50 million.
But none of that will be of any comfort to the family of the 36-year-old man who died after this clash with police. The Free State Premier sent condolences and appealed for calm.
We need to sit down and talk and work together. So we are already sending condolences to the family which is affected by this death.
By late afternoon, the mood was still tense. Businesses and schools were closed, and residents said that this matter was far from over. Richard Newton, SABC News.
All right, now 7 police officers accused of his murder and assault were acquitted in the Vicksburg Regional Court on March 2013. They were found not guilty on the grounds that Tatana's murderers could not be identified as they were wearing helmets. A British journalist at the time, though, said that he was easily able to identify Tatana's killers from that video footage. All right, so we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll have more for you on Media Monitor. Let's now take a look at our local papers here in South Africa, and for that we're joined again by William Bird, Director at Media Monitoring Africa. William, thanks very much indeed for joining us. There's some common stories on the Sunday newspapers, but a couple of them running individual stories, like the Sunday World has got former President Jacob Zuma on its front page.
Yes, exactly, and he's in the news again. This time not about his refusal or imminent arrest, but actually about the failure to pay his amount, or the amount that they're going to be asking back for VBS. As part of that, you will remember that he was given a loan for his house, a bond for his home. I think it was 6 million. I forget now the precise figure to cover that. And so they've come back. They've come to him. It was 7.8 according to the story. So they've come back and said, you need to pay us our money. So unless he makes some certain amount of payment, he's at risk of losing his home, in which place people will have nowhere to go for tea.
And I guess the big thing here is that the VBS is under curatorship at this stage, and so they've got to go after as many creditors, as many people as owe them money as possible. And 7.8 million is quite a chunk of change.
Well, relative to the grand heist that was involved there, it's small fry. In fact, earlier this week, there was the other members, 8 other people arrested in relation to the VBS theft. And if you read that story, there was one in, I think it was Daily Maverick. There they detailed some of the charges against those people, and each of the key figures in there, they range from around 30 to 30 million to, I think the least efficient of the thieves and that alleged thieves, and that was around 15 million rand that they all stole. So they're now at least going to be going on trial. So yeah, it's a big story, and I think the key thing we must never forget is that the money that they stole was poor people's money.
The City Press and the Sunday Independent leading with a similar story, and it really is about where we were this time a year ago and this time a year before that. It seems at the beginning of each year we go through the same story.
Yeah, the issue of students and not being financially excluded, and this whole issue of the missing middle. We'd hoped that they'd found some kind of mechanism to allow them to attend, and some way of funding them and covering their costs. But now, of course, the students are saying, get rid of our debt, or we're going to shut down the universities, which of course is a very worrying development, especially because we're still in the middle of a COVID pandemic. So not only are the issues of that spread, but it's our country's economy is that much worse than it was a couple of years ago. The mechanisms don't seem to have been put into place anywhere near effectively. This was a story that's been built up and been covered again over the course of this week, and this is now another one of those peaks where they're saying, clear us of that debt or else. And then at the same time, you had, I think, perhaps one of the most bizarre elements of the story was you saw Secretary General Ace Magashule marching with the students, and you kind of do a bit of a head turn. It's a bit like, if the CEO of Eskom were to march with the employees in a protest for them saying no more blackouts. It's kind of, it's really an extraordinary thing.
I suppose that there are, a couple of challenges with this one. The obvious one is it 14 billion rand in debt, and it's going to be very difficult to just write that amount off. And a lot of students are excluded because they don't pass or don't progress enough, and then they're stuck with this loans that they still owe and aren't allowed to re-register. And people are saying you can't exclude us, but it's not always clear-cut exactly what the story is and under what circumstances. But at the end of it, 14 billion rand, and the universities are saying that we can't function if we don't get paid.
Yeah, you know, the universities really are caught between a rock and a hard place. They've upped their numbers dramatically over the last couple of years in order to try and meet this increasing demand. But it is about making university accessible for those that can attend, and that they shouldn't be excluded just on the basis of the fact that they can't afford it. I mean, that is quite perverse. You know, I think the short answer is that we've got a lot of clever people in this country. We can work out answers to these things, and we can solve any of these problems. It is largely about a matter of political will and having the capacity to implement the kind of suggestions and solutions that have been put forward. You know, from my understanding of before this story had blown up again, was that there were suggestions and there were mechanisms that were put into place to deal with these things, and then certain of those elements haven't been carried through. So, but you can't have a scenario where your universities are expected to just keep writing these things off, and similarly, you can't have a scenario where students, just because they're poor, can't get through. And of course, as you say, then there are all those, you know, there are thousands of cases of greyness in the middle where, you know, they didn't do well enough because of X, Y, and Z, and then there are those that can't. And, you know, what do they do about that crippling system? And I guess it does lead itself to this sort of end point where it's all just a disaster. And I think that's why, you know, media and journalism is so important, because it has to be able to say and help explain to us these and these are the possible solutions, and this is what the different experts are saying.
Public Works Minister Patricia De Lille is on the front page of the Sunday Times. And, you know, again, this is another sadly familiar story, but 8 million rand she's chasing from MPs and ex-ministers who haven't paid their portion of rents of properties that they've been renting. I mean, that's pretty outrageous, isn't it?
I mean, it is. And again, you know, earlier in this, at the start of this program, we discussed about people who don't pay their TV licenses. You know, so this isn't unique to the SABC. This is people who owe money and don't pay it. Because if you go back, I think probably about 2 or 3 years ago, you'll find a very similar story where you look at the huge amount of debt that was owed to departments of public works, much of it from municipalities, much of it from within their own government systems, and much of it from their own personnel. You know, this is just a clever way by the minister of getting that issue back on the agenda by pointing out how many of their own people are failing to pay back the money that they owe.
All right, William Bird, always great talking to you. Thanks so much indeed for joining us on the program today, and we'll chat again soon.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Great. That's William Bird from Media Monitoring Africa. So now listen, you've got to be careful out there. Thanks for watching. You've been watching Media Monitor. Join us again next week at the same time. But in the meantime, COVID-19 is still out there. It's real. So please wash your hands, sanitize your hands, surfaces, social distances, but more than anything, wear a mask. Goodbye.